very affectionately. My name is Rita Abrahamson, I'm the director of CIPS. Today it is my very great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor T.V. Paul to CIPS. For many of us, especially those of us who've been around for a while, Professor T.V. Paul doesn't need much of an introduction given his long-standing and many outstanding contributions to the field of international relations and international security. He is the James McGill Professor of IR at McGill University in Montreal. He's one of those scholars whose CV is kind of intimidating. He is the author and editor of 18 books and over 65 scholarly articles and book chapters. And he's here today to talk to us about his latest book, Restraining Great Powers, Soft Balancing from Empires to the Global Era, which is hot off the press of Yale University Press. The last time he came to CIPS was about 4 years ago, and then he was launching another of his great contributions. So, we'll stay tuned. In another 4 years, we'll have him back with the next book, for sure. I think there isn't that much for me to say other than to say all these scholarly productions that T.V. Paul has done over the years has earned him a lot of other accolades and honors as well. Most of you will know that from 2016 to 2017 he was elected as president of the International Studies Association, which is a great honor and a great responsibility. And I learned today that he was, this year, elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Ooh. So that's quite something. So please join me in welcoming
It's really an honor to be here, and I must say, this is my first book launch for this book. So, and when I thought of places to go, Ottawa came to mind first because the last time I came for, I saw some books here. I signed some books, and it was a really engaging conversation. So that's the reason why I chose Ottawa as my first place, and I'm glad Rita and Stephanie and Peter all very kindly invited me and give me this opportunity. I won't go too much into all the details of my background, but in terms of the preparation for this book. But it came out of some 6-7 years of research. Some of you may be aware that in 2005, we had a special issue of International Security Journal where 3 of us, Bob Pate, myself, and Steve Walt, wrote 3 articles in favor of this concept, opposed by Bill Wohlforth and others. And since then, there have been some work conducted in many parts of the world, a lot of young scholars, but it never took off. And although it's my most cited article. So I started thinking about, is this such a new thing or it's been going on for a long time? Then the historical record gave me the impression that this is a strategy and approach great powers in particular have been following since the Congress of Vienna. And so I was struck that nobody thought about this angle, although Eikenberry has this very impressive book, After Victory, it's a liberal take. I borrow some of his ideas, but clearly there is something going on here. So I start out by talking about great powers, whom I started to dislike after writing this book. Although when you go to ISA and APSA, most recently in APSA in Boston, one of the, I don't dislike countries by the way, just in the concept of great power status. One of the panel was the American contribution to peace and order in the world. And sat there for a while. It was really problematic because no discussion of proxy wars or unnecessary wars or all that stuff. So that's starting point. They are the most violent actors in the 20th century. They have caused more death than anybody else, any other cause. Think about it. Natural cause is the other cause. Other than that, it's great power wars that cause the maximum deaths, according to Cal Holstein, whom we all respect as a reliable source. Indeed, if you look at this wars that they fought, world wars, and some 109 million casualties into the 2 world wars alone. Then the proxy wars, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. They are prone to fight big wars, engage in intense rivalries, they start small crises, engage in a lot of activities, although I must recognize they are the source also of regional orders. But there is a bit of a Tilly problem here, which is Tilly has this thing called security racketeering. You know, you create problems, then you are called to protect, the protector role, because nobody else will deal. And so you create more problems, and the racketeering keeps going because then they'll buy weapons and things like that. I'm simplifying it, but although I must say that this is a challenge because the great powers have created an aura among them. They have this halo. Since the European system, great powers are big players. You respect them. And our understanding of this conflict that they generate is very limited. And they created this aura partly because through propaganda, through institutional power, sheer material power, and then the big challenge to me, decisions for war are made by a small group of leaders, often men, even in the so-called liberal democratic societies. They have a contract with the citizenry. You go and die if I say war is necessary, and I decide it. And you elect sometimes, you mean we all elect sometimes reckless leaders. And these leaders sometimes fight for electoral reasons. There's a recent movie where I believe it is McNamara returning from Vietnam, and Nixon on the phone asking him, oh, how are things going there? Have you decided about the bombing or something like that? And he doesn't want to start the bombing, and he says, think about it. The elections are coming, okay? It's on his conversation. So it just shows that these wars are not often fought simply for, prudent reasons or international order. It's basically Nixon wanted to get re-elected, so that's another issue. Now the question is, will great power wars recur? China's rise, resurgence of Russia, a lot of things are happening. United States is trying to bring back itself after a decline that people thought was coming. But I think it is, we may ridicule Trump, but what I think he's trying to do is to regain hegemony through the kind of power and material power that he can accrue. We all know the Thucydides trap argument, although that can be talked about and discussed. There's a lot of literature in our power transition group where talk about the potential for conflict when a rising power and an established power engage in competitive behavior. So the question is that there is a general assumption that nuclear weapons are deterring, preventing general deterrence. The question is whether this is sufficient to prevent small wars, limited wars, intense arms races, rivalries. I just published a little piece in Global Asia, if anybody's interested, looking at time pressure. Time pressure accrues over a period of time. Simple as Britain and Germany had an arms race, naval arms race in the early 19th century, 20th century. And it took about 10, 15 years to mature. Japan and the United States, same in the Pacific, 30s and 20s, it took another 20, 30 years. So are we witnessing something like that in the South China Sea today? And I think that is a fundamental question. Are we sleepwalking into the next, not probably big war, but at least definitely a rivalry, and China and Russia are now forming a kind of an alliance as well. The intensified arrival of globalization and economic interdependence gave a lot of hope to those who understand this process as preventing war, interdependence, school in particular thought, maybe this is the way to prevent the next big rivalry. Traditional approaches to peace among great powers, you have the balance of power approach, you have deterrence, you have containment. All these are realist approaches. And if you look at the security policies of major powers for the last 300 years or so, since 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, relied heavily on balance of power. Although the idea goes back to a lot of historical periods in other civilizations too. The premises of balance of power important. All the realist arguments, international system anarchic, states want to survive, power competition natural, somebody will try to dominate if they are not countervailed. Equilibrium is necessary, maintaining equal capacity, equal power, to prevent one from taking over the other. So survival and sovereign independence requires that states engage in military competition, building up, or ally with stronger partners and create an equilibrium. So I kind of create these 2-3 types of balancing. We call this hard balancing, what I just described, relying on arms buildup, the alliance formation, and the techniques are internal balancing through arms buildup and external balancing through alignments. So weaker parties tend to align together, form coalitions. Now the puzzle for us is why there is no intense hard balancing since the end of the Cold War. Obviously, we can talk about the threat environment remain low, intensified globalization, widespread international institutions, norms of territorial integrity, technological innovations of warfare that allowed defense and deterrence as opposed to offense, absence of intense nationalism, and absence of an expansionist power, as the Soviet Union or before that, Germany and Japan. And so balancing against threats is sort of the approach here, and you don't find that reason for counterbalancing happening. People can question whether the United States is viewed differently. I'll come to that in a few minutes. So then the question of self-balancing, an idea that sort of, I'm redefining it. One of the criticisms of scholars on this variety of work in the international security articles was the definition was not strong. I'm defining it as restraining the power of a state through international institutions, concerted diplomacy, while limited informal ententes and partnerships, and economic sanctions. So 3 things: limited informal ententes, concerted diplomacy through institutions, to make its aggressive actions less legitimate in the eyes of the world, and hence its strategic goals more difficult to obtain. It's a long one, but it's necessary to pin down 2-3 elements that create self-balancing. So there's no active military formation, limited tacit indirect balancing. But there is another in-between category that is what I call limited hard balancing, where states form asymmetrical or engage in a symmetrical arms buildup, semi-formal alliances such as strategic partnership. Now we are seeing that a lot in contemporary world. India, for instance, has this partnership emerging with the United States, with Japan. So a lot of ASEAN countries have also, Vietnam, for instance, is forming one. So that is sort of a limited hard balancing vis-a-vis China. So the big question is, for soft balancing, what is the big source? And the key source are institutions. So here I'm trying to generate another dimension to institutional literature. International institutions are useful component to restrain aggressive behavior of great powers, or any power for that matter. They serve a number of purposes. They prevent costly arms races sometimes, and they can discourage or restrain states more than the functions given to them by institutionalists, or the discussion in liberal institutionalism, for instance. So cooperation, coordination, facilitating transactions, overcoming cooperation dilemmas, all that. So this is not to argue institutions are not used by great powers for other purposes, for power politics, for instance. Or institutions are always successful, okay? This is a very important to realize. Institutions are not always successful. In fact, many times they fail in security issues. But great powers again and again use institutions, international institutions, to balance and restrain each other, aggressive behavior. And that also doesn't mean they don't use other mechanisms. And so we need to identify how they do this. But the IR literature does not give much by way of what do institutions do to restrain threatening behavior. And I think Alexandra here can probably help me. Sort of any literature that exists, I don't see that developed sufficiently. So then I look at history. History is my interesting part here. And I find the concept of Europe very much an institutional self-balancing happening there. League of Nations, allied powers try to restrain Germany and Italy in particular against its Abyssinian invasion. Japan, its invasion, occupation of China, League of Nations and sanctions and arms control measures, etc. Even during the Cold War, but they were not successful, by the way, I'll come to that, era, the great powers used institutions whenever it was in their interest to restrain the other side. But one group of states that use institutions very actively were the non-aligned states. Non-alignment has not been properly theorized in the context of this sort of behavior, strategic behavior. I hope people who do non-alignment pick up I call it a limited self-balancing. It's really, these guys were trying to deny legitimacy to the arms race, legitimacy to colonizations or decolonization. Arms race was a big deal for them. The test ban, and Nehru was the one who proposed the standstill agreement, non-proliferation treaty. You take any new international economic order. What does that all do? That the great power system has to change its behavior. Not successful all the time, except for decolonization, which I think we need to give them credit to some extent. Institutional change there quite a bit. So all these have one thing in common: denial of legitimacy to the threatening great power. Great powers use institutions to legitimate their power and delegitimize the power of or threatening policies of their opponents. And great powers do this because they know durable status as a great power is based on legitimacy accorded by the international system. Now this is the English school insight here in some extent. Michael was here, probably I would have sought his understanding. It's really look at the great power without legitimacy has this big problem. And legitimacy comes through institutional means. Legitimacy is defined, I'm using the existing definition, tacit acceptance of social structure in which power is exercised, lawfulness by virtue of being authorized or in accordance with the law. So gaining legitimacy through institutions is part of a great power's efforts to gain acceptance by others for its behavior. And balance of power, whether hard balancing or soft balancing, traditionally been based on certain legitimacy arguments. And Europeans put a lot of emphasis on legitimacy in their discussion on balance of power. And then when you come to the Cold War, post-Cold War period, you have cases. You have US, Kosovo and Iraq, both attempts by the Allied states as well as Russia and China to stop Iraq from going in, US from going into war in Kosovo. Did not succeed. Iraq again did not succeed. China's rise and expansion in South China Sea, now in the Indian Ocean, has not really evoked the kind of hard balancing which we expect. Even Russia's activities in the Ukraine and Crimea, of course, a lot more balancing there. That's interesting. But China, it is self-balancing now. It's becoming more limited hard balancing, not intense hard balancing. US case is very interesting because this 2003 case is one classic example for me here. Now it was concerned states did engage in a kind of intense self-balancing, including Germany and France, denying UN Security Council approval, a lot of other forums, and not joining the coalition, engaging in. So forming this diplomatic coalition meant to stop, and if that doesn't succeed, make the invasion and occupation illegitimate, which they succeeded in the eyes of the world. And so question is, people say that it was a failure, so why do you bother about it? No, it was not a failure when you think about what it did to American domestic politics. President Obama, candidate Obama, took it up. He said, we are now very unpopular great power. We need to withdraw to re-establish our legitimacy, our power in the world. And that's exactly what he did. Whether the withdrawal succeeded or not, they had to go back again, that's another issue. So legitimacy became a very important part of Obama's strategy and re-legitimation. And I do think that this may have some relevance in today's world. Yes, we are living through that phase of not even Bush, something more than that. And that it may require a re-legitimation through another leader or group of people who I don't know who that's going to be. So this is a case of soft balancing working in a different way. Okay, it's not necessarily stopping aggression, but it doesn't necessarily mean it didn't help. The rise of China is my other big case, which I'm sure most of you are interested. China is a very clever soft balancer on its own. It is not doing the kind of thing that would provoke others to create a big, intense balance of power competition, alliances. It hasn't formed any serious alliances yet. Even with Pakistan, it's a very limited alliance. With Russia, now it is talking, but it's a limited hard balancing. It was soft balancing before that. So why did they allow China to become so powerful? Our question is going to haunt America, I'm sure. You are a real political person, especially since the Clinton period. And now, why there hasn't been a big, intense balancing coalition? Reasons are many things China is doing are very slow. The BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, is an economic way to expansion. Doesn't involve yet major military part, although it is coming. And that China is the largest trading partner of almost all states of Asia Pacific and most of the states in the world today, which gives it enormous power. And so if you are your number one trading partner, you're not going to balance against that power. This is an enormous change in this Chinese strategy in that sense. China is also creating institutions, joining institutions, playing institutions, engaging ASEAN, not necessarily successful all the time, the code of conduct, etc. ASEAN is trying to do soft balancing. Okay, we are simply, there's no other description for that particular behavioral pattern. And this is something that we need to look into. Now, I want to talk a little bit about balancing against threats. That's what's happening. It's not balancing against power. There are multiple strategies involved in today's world. I won't go into it. I want to talk a little bit about the ideal conditions for soft balancing. The threat environment has to be low. Often great powers resort to institutions during the early post-war years. This is another thing that institutionalists haven't given much of. They think that institutions survive, keep going. Institutions' golden era is the first decade or first 2 decades after World War, so Cold War type big wars, ending of that conflict. And what we are witnessing is there was a big proliferation of institutions at the end of the Cold War. Today we are starting to lose their punch. And this is partly because institutions require sustenance and nourishment, and often they are not given by the so-called great powers because they lose interest. Or institutions become a drag on their power. So Trump is, sometimes these leaders don't say it in so many words. Trump is the first one to say, articulate exactly what he feels. So it's very interesting to see us get out of all these constraints that we created, some of them, by the way. So if they are post-war creations and then they lose their charm, we need to think about ways to maintain them if at all they are necessary. And that is missing in, by the way, institutional literature has a lot more to do, which is why what the more I look at it is that there's an ideological connection to institutionalism, European Union in particular, and people keep repeating the good things they do. They do a lot of bad things too, which again, they can generate nationalism and violence in the international order. So Second, the conditional international order gives great powers opportunity to make substantial economic progress without conquest. The Cold War ended, and one of the greatest things, whether we like it or not, the United States and of course others did was give China and potentially India quite a bit of opportunity to become economic players. So economic deprivation now, as it being starting to impose, will bring back great power rivalry. Mark my word, because the opportunity that was given to them encouraged them to lie low, not to engage in the kind of intense conflict. Third, legitimacy matters to great powers. Legitimacy is a key for their status, and leaders have to realize that without international legitimacy, your power is not durable. Your power is not respected. You don't have allies. You don't have friends to worship you. You know, that kind of stuff. The level of nationalism must be low among great powers. Military technology and geographic configuration do not allow quick advancement. So today's weaponry helps the kind of process, because we have deterrent weapons, we have defensive weapons. But imagine a world where somebody acquires a capability to dominate the world without hurting themselves. That will be a very offense-driven world, and technology is getting there, I believe, in some of these areas. Now, I want to respond to critics because these criticisms have not been responded properly by my colleagues. I'm going to say that. Criticisms are the following. There is little empirical support, simple diplomatic friction, and not a concerted policy. Episodic behavior, hence lacks consistency. A rhetorical device rather than an active policy instrument. Not too many cases to make a theoretically strong argument. A policy instrument, success of which is not guaranteed, may have relevance only under conditions of unipolarity and hence little value for other systems. So I'm going to reject all of them. Good social scientist. Soft balancing has considerable empirical support, as I will show in subsequent chapters, drawing case studies from the concept of Europe onwards. It is not a day-to-day simple diplomatic friction we are discussing. The case studies show that countries use this consistently to restrain power, aggressive policies of a targeted state. Non-great power states also increasingly use these instruments as conscious policy instruments and on a consistent basis. Third, a policy soft balancing is a rational response and often caused by difficulties on relying on hard balancing to achieve behavioral change. Because you cannot impose hard balancing ideas into a situation where you will lose considerably, you become the enemy of the United States or China straight away. Whereas soft balancing is in between, gives you some level of influence without really hurting your trade relationship, etc. Fourth, there is no guarantee that hard balancing efforts can create peace, as balance of power is seldom achieved on a permanent basis, and the temptation to break the balance is high among revisionist powers. This is actually a big debate, like people like Weisheimer and all his followers tend to argue, even Kenneth Walls, balancing records, the only way to create international order is through hard balancing, what he is referring to hard balance. The problem is, we don't even know when you achieve balancing. The American scholars or policymakers who say, we need balance of power in Asia Pacific to maintain peace and order. What do they mean by that? American preponderance is needed to maintain peace. They are actually repeating Gilpin, not Kenneth Walls. If you have a proper balance of power, China should be there, equal to you. That to the United States is not balance of power. There is a lot of misreading of what balance of power is all about. European powers create equilibrium so that no aggressor will come. But for the United States, it's this dominance that creates peace. Then that is preponderance, opposite of balance of power. Balance of power is parity preserves peace. And so we have this misreading of what balance of power is all about. And so there's no guarantee. In fact, European history is full of balance of power failure. There are asymmetrical means to break a balance. And I have written a book in my first dissertation, Asymmetrical War Initiations. And in a lot of ways, what China is doing, asymmetrical strategy. Its weapons are not one-on-one. It is developing anti-satellite weapons, anti-submarine weapons. The idea is that the United States cannot achieve its goals, or now a lot of using cyber war. These are asymmetrical response to overwhelming power. So this implicit assumption is that military balancing tend to work more effectively and doesn't have evidence in history. You have both ways. Okay, sometimes they do. Cold War is one example. But it was not a peaceful period. If you live in Vietnam or part of Latin America or Africa or South Asia, Cold War was a bloody era. Only the Europeans had some peace, and Canadians, we benefited some. But what is peace? I mean, that's another big issue, no? Many wars, European era, were blamed on balance of power, failure, underbalancing. When do you know? Randy Scholler has this big thesis. Underbalancing is the cause of World War II. How do we know it was underbalanced? What does it require? Well, they say that the defender needed 1 to 5 superiority. If you don't have superiority, the opponent can start a war. Hitler calculated that. It will take them quite a bit of time to get this. And when the Allied powers reached only 5 times superiority, they could defeat Germany, okay? So we have to be very careful when we talk about balance of power versus preponderance. So they are relevant in every systems, as I show the case studies, multipolar, bipolar, and unipolar. Soft laws, soft power are all big deal in IR, by the way. They are not defined properly, all the fussy terms. But soft law, there's a lot of good literature on it. Without soft law, there is no international law, by the way, because they are not hard laws. And so we have to give some value to these concepts that are soft, because world is very different from the European world. All the IR discussion is based on Europe in the past and Europe now, institutionalists in particular, whereas realist, it's Europe in the past, or a kind of Cold War preference. So we need to look at these softer approaches, because international order is not a very hard and fast thing. It requires fungibility, it requires softness, and I think that is what this is all about. Because the world is more complex. You don't get allies easily. Allies don't fight for you just like that. And fighting itself is useless. There are a lot of these constraints. And I'm looking at richness as opposed to very rigorous research. Of course, as much rigor as possible. Skeptics are often, especially realist institutions, deride the useless things. They're useless if you look at them that way, but why do these great powers put all the emphasis on institutions? Why do they pay for them? Why is Mr. Trump going to New York? Although nobody wants to see him either. But why is he there? It's a useless thing, just stay home, no? He's going, whether to sell his point of view, whatever. Institutions have a value, it's propaganda maybe, but your legitimacy is enhanced when institutions take up your cause, support you. And so the criticisms reflect a political understanding of their value, and we need to look at even classical realists, by the way, give a lot of importance to institutions, E.H. Cobb to Morgenthau and all that. But this modern version is not. And so institutions has no value. The same logic can be applied to balancing through weaponry and alliances. What is the value there? Now, just going to conclude because I know my time is up. Emerging world order. I do think that soft balancing is going to be a major part of emerging world order, and limited hard balancing. Partly because until you have a very nationalist, expansionist great power, the incentive for alliance formations are low. You may get a period of tensions. Russia is balanced through NATO to some extent. China-Russia alliance is potentially possible, but only if you push them to the limit, which I think NATO and the United States may have to work very hard. So I want to conclude with the Trump challenge. I had another one, but I didn't want to put because I'm going to the United States to give the same talks and do something he doesn't want to do. But this one gives him a lot of power. I mean, he's this macho man sitting there and he's controlling the discussion. So he's definitely posing a lot of challenge to both hard balancing because he's against alliances or alliances that free riding to some extent, and soft balancing through institutions. His goal is to resurrect American hegemony and power through isolation unilateral military buildup, tariffs, and both fronts enforce alike. So you are seeing a certain kind of soft balancing also, along with actually the State Department people are all creating these other efforts. So they go to India, want to create a soft balancing plus a hard balancing coalition, Vietnam, etc. The question is, how long will it last? I think we are going through a cycle. United States has still residual liberal and openness in it. And the US needs allies if it wants to restrain, control China and Russia. Heavy weapons they are building are not going to be enough to stop BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative. US electorate may be susceptible to soft balancing, as Obama was able to muster opposition, rebuild American reputation and credibility. Globalization's trajectory and the pressure for deglobalization by populists across the world, of course, is imponderable. And Carl Polanyi has this famous argument about double movement. The history comes in cycles, and you may have pushback, but then you have contraction. So what is important is not to lose hope. Think of resurrecting institutions, resurrecting legitimacy, influencing American domestic opinion, electoral politics. But what I'm noticing is so-called liberals and progressives have withdrawn, basically. They're not fighting back. I mean, the kind of fighting is very different. They need more sustained campaigning and ideas for removing some of the challenges the liberal world is facing, including economic inequality. So soft balancing is not a panacea for all the ills, and I have examples where it failed, also caused war. Japan and Italy. Italy was incensed with the whole League of Nations sanctions over its Ethiopian invasion. Japan, the militaries took over as a result of League of Nations and American sanctions. But what else is there to preserve international order when you think about the constraints we are facing in a very globalized world? So I think I'm going to stop there. And I have chapters of my book, and all these things are discussed more clearly. Some photos I took, I need to make sure I'm not talking. These are some data on China's exports to different countries, Russia, Northeast, to the European Union, and mostly gas. So that makes it very complicated. Anyway, I will stop there and pick up any questions.
Thank you very much. That's really very, very interesting, and we have about half an hour, 35 minutes or so for questions and answers. Can I just remind people that our practice is that you kindly introduce yourselves when you pose your question, and that you keep your interventions reasonably short. Thank you. To Alexandra, please.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm Alexandra Gece. I'm with CIPS Undergraduate School. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk, as always. So many questions. Let me just put a few on the table, and I will let you decide which, if any, you wish to address. And perhaps if I could start with a bit of IR theory, because I was fascinated. Again, you covered so much ground conceptually as well as empirically. And I was wondering where you would place your approach, because there were times when I heard echoes of constructivism, where you were talking about legitimacy, norms, the value of institutions, but going beyond what a liberal would probably talk about. And then I was also interested in saying we need to perhaps recapture some of the complexity of classical realism, particularly Morgenthau, and I think you're absolutely right. But I was wondering at the end of the day, where you would place yourself? I mean, are you moving in a direction of a more eclectic,
yes,
let's say, approach, as someone like Peter
I'm not moving, I'm already eclectic.
And what the implications might be for your current and future work. And then perhaps in more practical terms, I was very interested in your discussion of what you call the ideal conditions for soft balancing. And I'm wondering if I could invite you to perhaps say a bit more about, in your view, the relative importance of all those different conditions. And do you think that some of them are absolutely vital, others less important? How do you see them in relation to one another? And finally, and a very open question, which is, having engaged in this fascinating tour de force, both historical and geographical, is there anything that you found particularly intriguing or surprising? Anything that you learned in the course of this research that you did not expect with respect to self-balancing in particular, but anything else as well? Thank you so much once again.
Yeah, I'll pick up thanks for the good questions. The last question, I was kind of working on it. I thought self-balancing is always peace-preserving. And my revelation is self-balancing is not, it can generate intense violence. Include economic sanctions as part of it. Sanctions on certain great powers in the past made nationalism possible within those countries. The Japanese case is very interesting. The army faction, different factions, and the navy faction wanted to go to the south, the army faction wanted to go to the north towards Russia, and the navy faction win because of the US sanctions. So, self-balancing, causing this. The decision to attack is they are going to deny us oil. We can last for a year and a half. After that, we are lost. Our empire is gone. So, sanctions are self-balancing, the American point of view. That was my willingness to say that in the book. Many people will ideologically say, self-balance. This is the problem of the institutions too. We have to say when institutions fail. And most institutions don't do that, or cause violence or conflict. So I hope that is one of the things. The first question, I am an eclectic scholar. I am a big fan of that work that Kassenstein and Sill did, and I have a chapter in that too. And if you read almost all my books, I have a section on eclecticism. I like to call myself because I find pigeonholing very problematic. Secondly, a phenomenon like this, balancing is kind of a realist term, power is involved. So how do you make sense? And bridging these paradigms, to my mind, is the way to go, because paradigms, although I know the Kuhn, Lakatos debates, they can create a lot of progress, but progress in which way? When you read Walls or when you read Mearsheimer, you think, okay, he's describing this one aspect of international politics. But to capture the complexity, we need to go eclectic. I think that is one thing attractive for policymakers too. They cannot follow walls. Okay? If you follow walls, you have to build up nuclear weapons to preserve peace, which they are doing, but that is not enough. We know that. Mearsheimer, okay, everybody will expand. So what? Anybody is a great power potential is not going to stop. We know that, but stopping, at least restraining, that is possible, so it's one thing that way. So I think there is a methodological challenge here. At the same time, there is a utility that I see younger scholars in particular, if you are interested in a more historical phenomena. And I'm also more interested in puzzles and paradoxes. So that gives me opportunity to engage different lines of scholarship, which sometimes make you're neither here nor there sort of thing, but that's fine. I mean, at this stage in my career, I want to connect people rather than separate them. The second question is the ideal importance. Yes, I think the presence of good institutions, the post-war period, have been very important for my understanding. And that's also a time when you have globalization usually emerging, economic interdependence possible, less expansionism, all this possible in periods, historical systemic conditions where great powers don't think of themselves as expansionism. But there is one variable that is most important, that is it's the low level of nationalism, the low level of aggressiveness. That may be caused by other factors. So that's another thing that we haven't studied in IR properly. When do nationalism resurface great powers? When do they generate nationalism? What do policies, outside policy, especially the kind of strategic interaction problem, generate this sort of nationalism? And we are witnessing that right now. And will the Chinese become very nationalist? Will Russia, sort of thing. So I think that is one. But technology matters too. You can be very nationalistic, but if you don't have the technology to advance, where are you going to go? The Germans were able to do a lot of things because they had the tank and the aircraft, which allowed blitzkrieg. But right now, there's not a whole lot. I mean, you try to expand with your aircraft carriers, you know, maybe at the next stage, the outer space. That's why Trump wants a new army division for that. Many countries, by the way, are doing it. It's not just from outer space, violating the outer space treaty problem. And so it is going to be very interesting, this desire for achieving preponderance through some new technology. But at the moment, they don't look like that's going to be easy, given the nuclear dilemma, nuclear revolution up to a point. But asymmetrical challenges are still very possible. So, yeah, your questions are all very good. And I try to answer as much my justification for these positions in the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Professor here at the graduate school. A really interesting book. I enjoyed reading it, as always. A lot of food for thought. A couple of observations, just really to invite you to go further on a couple of points. I was struck by your using the non-aligned movement as an example of successful soft balancing. Most historians of the Great War, of the Cold War, who of course are all Northern, tend to view the non-aligned movement as having been really not particularly successful. Decolonization was going to happen anyways. These countries weren't able, for the most part, to stop the Northern powers from using them as cockpits for proxy wars and so on. Therefore, they tend to be dismissive of the non-aligned. And yet you say the non-aligned movement actually was more successful than you give it credit. I just wonder if you could go into that a little bit more. It was rather interesting to me. Secondly, I was struck in the book, but also in your comments here, by your very correct observation that you know, the great power or the great power of the day often makes the point that dominance brings peace, not balancing. You know, the argument, it's, by the way, an argument the Israelis use regionally in the Middle East. Our dominance is what brings peace. You know? And you're quite right to question that. I mean, I often think when I hear that, what they're really saying is that our dominance is required to bring an acceptable peace, the peace that we want, the peace that's consistent with our interests. And therefore, if I could extend that, I mean, I think what you're, as I understand it, and I ask you to agree or disagree, but what you're saying is that this business of soft balancing is that it's a way of the less powerful countries getting the powerful countries to accept a less than optimal peace, to accept, you know, through a variety of means, to accept that rather than their dominance, it's a concert which brings peace. And I mean, how much experience have we really had in weaker countries getting more powerful to really accept that? Or has it been circumstances at various times in histories which have forced the more powerful countries to accept that? Just some observations.
Yeah, both are very good questions. First of all, non-alignment. You're absolutely right. Non-alignment has been given a very bad rap in the Western intellectual world, partly because many of these countries eventually became friends with Soviet Union, United States a few, but not many, or were vulnerable, you know. But there is a new resurgence in the Bantu spirit. A lot of people are writing, including Western scholars in Australia and all that. The Bantu was history's first time weaker states joining together and forming a soft balancing coalition, challenging the international order. You should read the resolutions they passed. End the arms race, get rid of all the colonies, racism, you know, all the things that we hate today. Nina Tannenwald, one of my friends who wrote the book, The Nuclear Taboo, and my own book, The Tradition of Non-Use, both of us independently did some work on what the non-aligned movement did for nuclear, that tradition, or in her word, the taboo. She gives a third place to this group. We're constantly fighting in the UN forums, in various 18-nation disarmament. In fact, it was in response to them that Atoms for Peace proposal was proposed. In response to them was the partial test ban treaty was proposed by the great powers. Of course, NPT level, it becomes a very different game, but NPT originally was proposed by these, India included, okay, a non-discriminatory NPT. And they were very active, even after the NPT came into being within the UN system, as you know. They were also fighting for a certain kind no first use, etc. So nuclear area, then the nuclear free zones, many of them in America, different parts of the world. Decolonization. Any historian who do serious work on it say, without the normative push and the constant, many African small states would not have been decolonized the fast speed with which it happened, the 60s in particular. And so, how do you measure, quantify whose influence? But it became a kind of if you use a constructivist lingo, it became a kind of a stigma holding colony. And that is due to a lot of elements, and these folks do have a lot of role in creating that stigma. So I think there are books on that too that talks about their role. May not be enough. The Western scholars tend to have a bias against them, as you're absolutely correct. New international economic order, yes, we say nothing much happened. But UNTAD debates, Krasner wrote that book, remember Structural Conflict. He was a realist. Why did he write a book? There was intense pressure by these guys in forums in the United Nations. Even today, G77 and all, they are active. Now we may say you won't have a correlation directly showing. But I think a good work is needed on their role, recognizing their weaknesses. What happens is when they are in trouble with each other, like India and Pakistan, Pakistan was never part of the they go for weapons. And why that is so? Because the Soviets were very much sympathetic to some of their causes. Whether it is decolonization, which means the Western powers had to give up their colonies, or nuclear disarmament, although they were not following. A lot of things they supported them. That's partly why it became kind of pro-Soviet in that sense. I'm not justifying or I'm not saying it's a full success. It can never be because it was an amalgam of states with multiple goals. But you look at it from a structural point of view, time in history, small states or even within European context, not too many small states existed in the world anyway, as ability to fight this, have this ability to join. And so that normative change is massive in the sense. It gave a sense to them that they are players. And you may remember Nehru was a big player in world politics in the 50s and until 62 when we lost the war with China. He was considered as a statesman to be recognized. So the Nehruvian ideas are very important. Panchsheel, still the 5 principles of coexistence, still important in the China context. So I don't want to venerate or worship, but I'm more and more recognizing that small states can act as norm entrepreneurs, using again the constructivist language, and that it is important to recognize even in this context. So, I would. But your second question is the great power dominance. This is the big problem. I think Gilpin is the one who lost it. Now that I'm getting into theory, people are losing interest in this. There was an article by Bill Wolforth recently saying that it's a tragedy that Walls won, not Gilpin, for realism. If the Gilpinian IR won, we could have had a very different IR today, because he could talk about change, peaceful change, etc., whereas Walls cannot. But Walls was very smart. The timing was excellent. End of the Cold War, before the Cold War was at peak. And anyway, so the argument is that peace cannot be achieved without overwhelming preponderance of preferably a liberal hegemon, the hegemonic stability theory. That's precisely what these countries are believers of that, United States in particular. Balance of power, our theory would predict you need 2 equal coalitions, like Cold War, maintaining order. And that's what Walls is talking about. He likes balance of power, and using historical or microeconomic theory. So the problem is, many people who talk about balance of power confuse between these two. And if you ask the policymakers, it's basic, Americans in particular, basically the moment American dominance is gone, you're going to get wars and conflict. That's a challenge. How do we clarify these and tell people either stick with preponderance or stick with balance?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Marco. I'm a master's student at school. So my question relates to a book published by Anne Slaughter, a new world poverty.
Pardon?
Can you just speak up a little bit?
Yes, so the book is a new world order that talks about by Anne Slaughter. she talks about the role of transgovernmentalism and how states use it to gain power in the same way. So how do you think that relates to your theory of self-balance and the way that states can use it? She talks about legislatures, judges, and sometimes even policymakers use it to influence the state for the benefit. Do you think that
I haven't read it carefully, so I can't comment on the book because I didn't read it for my book also. Maybe I should have. Yeah, if she's talking about internal balancing, internal self-balance, I don't want to use that word. Internal restraints by various components in a democracy, that's different in some sense. Although the idea is to restrain state actions, but I'm talking about external actors. So if you look at all the components I have are external players, not internal restraints. So maybe there are similarities. Balance of power itself, by the way, has internal equivalents. American Constitution makers wanted to create checks and balances. No element of the legislature or judiciary or executive become too strong. So balance of power is a bit long historical, comes out of Enlightenment period, Europeans, but it's a scientific thing to talk about equilibrium. So yeah, there are similarities, but it's complicated, it's already complicated, as Alexandra pointed out, to go into other domains, which will make the book potentially possible. People introduce themselves, that would be nice.
Daniel McCarthy from the University of Melbourne. Just a question about the kind of social content and its relationship to ideas of legitimacy. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, because when you were talking about legitimacy, I didn't get a sense of that the actual content of ideas mattered in making things legitimate or illegitimate, right? And I was wondering if you could comment on that, as to how telling somebody, you can have, for example, human rights or not have human rights will affect, or we were going to violate your sovereignty or not, will affect the content of legitimacy and its acceptance by various audiences. That's the first question. The second question is just legitimate to whom? I wasn't sure which of the audiences you were speaking of when you were talking about making claims legitimate. We were talking about legitimate to global publics in the global south, for example, or we're talking about legitimate to other great powers. I didn't get a sense of that. And again, it's probably just because a lot to condense in quite a big book.
Yeah, I think great powers generally want legitimacy from other great powers and non-great powers. So it's still a very power-centric. Legitimacy from the global public, some may, like Pew, does this status kind of thing. But often from an international, this kind of conflict, war situation, especially threatening war situation, it is how many countries support you, maybe the people within those countries need not. So to some extent, historically legitimacy is given to a great power when they are accepted as a club member at post-war settlements, San Francisco, 1945, or Congress of Vienna, or Versailles, and they are given this role as the lead members. You are now a member of this club by other great powers who are often winners of wars. And so, but to maintain that status, Jack Levy has quite a bit of definition of what is a great power, how is it done, what's the legitimacy role there. To maintain that in the contemporary world in particular, you need a lot more than just weapons and threatening behavior. The past, it was whether you could intervene without getting it back. So, Mr. Trump's reading, for instance, of legitimacy is probably very different from the reading of, if at all he understands this concept, from other folks like Obama. Legitimacy would mean acceptance of your power position as legitimate and reasonable and, as a good thing for the world. Whereas for some, legitimacy is my writ runs the world, sort of thing. So this classical versus more nuanced forms. The European scholars in particular have done quite a bit of work on, English school in particular, what legitimacy is. And I'm kind of relying or narrowing it to acceptance as legitimate power by others, other states in particular, rather than going into all kinds of the social aspects of it, because then the book again will become very unwieldy, although I cite some of them, by the way, I'm sensitive to that. So there's a lot of room for that, but legitimacy is a concept that is useful. If you want to use normative or institutional way to restrain somebody, are you going to be legitimate after your invasion? That's the question. Or in order to regain your legitimacy, you need, if you look at power as comprehensive, especially for a hegemon, then you need more than coercive power. So it's a concept that requires a lot of interesting discussion, but I think, again, the concept is not properly defined, but I use a couple of definitions from dictionary better than scholarly definitions. Being accepted. So, there's room for more work on that.
There was a second question?
No, that was.
Yeah, okay,
thank you.
excellent. Then yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Zulfi Sadek. I'm a retired civil servant from Global Affairs. Quick question of clarification on institutions. Do you mean institutions as in United Nations and its agencies only, or do you also mean military alliances like NATO? And my second question is, I didn't hear, and maybe it's in the book, but I didn't hear any allusion to divergent or conflicting corporate interests and how that might drive the policy direction that will lead to balancing in whatever fashion. Because a harmonious world is not necessarily conducive to the growth of the defense industry, for instance. And we all know they have legitimate interests and they have ways of making things happen. And so how do you fit corporate interests into your analysis? Or would you rather not?
Yeah, I'd rather not, because that will make it very complicated analysis. Military-industrial complex, I know you're referring to that, is very much part of arms race, arms build-up. But then there is a Marxist or neo-Marxist explanation to that. Yeah, I don't go into that. I think there are a lot of reasons for arms build-up. That's one of them, but other reasons too. But if the corporations are the reason why we don't have big arms build-up, maybe globalization has something to do with it. The companies that make money, more money, are not the Krupps or the military builders anymore. The Googles and the Facebooks, etc. Although they use that for coercive purposes too.
You'd be surprised at the use of the technology.
Yes. Other people use them.
Yes.
So, but they are at least outwardly not interested in military. Indeed, in the current globalization, overwhelming companies, I would argue, that are interested in peaceful world. They don't want competition, military competition with China, for instance, because they're afraid that will push them out of that big market. So this idea of generalizing all corporations are for military build-up is a problematic one, especially in the contemporary world. Some may be, the big buck makers are, but that's very different. Second question, yes, I'm talking about non-military institutions. Military institutions are for balancing purposes. So the strategic partnerships that are in the limited hard balancing. So my institutions are for soft balancing. You are talking about multilateral or bilateral or regional institutions that are non-military. So NATO is not an example. NATO is a hard balancing institution. So that's very clear in the discussion.
Right. Yes, please.
My name's Sam. I'm a student here at the school. I have a question more so about maybe a prediction you might have, or looking forward at the way great powers will conduct themselves in the future. A lot of what we talked about in IR theory is that a lot of it tends to be founded in the historical era that it arises. Realism is very much a response to the Cold War. And recently we've seen ourselves enter into a more ambiguous period of IR theory where there are no dominant theories in the way that there were dominant theories when Ken Waltz or Morgenthau were writing. And I'm wondering if you think that this ambiguity or this flexibility or this unknown nature of this new era in IR will lead to an emergence of maybe a new type of great power that operates outside of kind of the way that we traditionally understood them, maybe a decline in great powers as a major actor. We'll see more states play a greater role rather than kind of 5 to 10 major players acting as they did kind of before the Second World War or the concert in Europe or whatnot. Or maybe something else, maybe we'll see the fortification of this traditional idea of power being vested in just a handful of states. A couple of the strongest countries will sweep in and fill that gap. I want your thoughts on how that will
Big question, yes.
So,
Anybody?
because we're coming towards the end, I'm going to take the last question as
Okay,
well, and you can answer the two
yes.
together, and then
So we end at 1:15.
Well, we can go a little bit over that.
Oh.
We'll go over that, but just to make sure that we are ready to leave the room when the next lot of people come, I will take the last question, and then we can go further. Please.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rajizada. I'm with Carleton University's Institute of European and Russian Communication Studies. I just published an article discussing politics and security in the wider Black Sea area, the area where Turkey and Russia started regional cooperation, and I tried to discuss it in the context of the security community. Therefore, I can give a lot of credit to and fully subscribe to what you said about eclecticism and whether mainstream IR theories are individually capable of explaining the whole picture and all aspects of world politics and even regional politics. Given your explanation and justification, I would agree with the title if you can change the word restraining to hindering, because the synonyms for restraining is stopping and preventing, and I'm not absolutely convinced with that. And also another question is the way you explain legitimacy. How is it different from a pop star seeking attention and acceptance from its followers?
Like the last one. I have actually written a book on status, edited a collection, Status in World Politics. I would encourage you to read actually Debbie Larson, myself, and Bill Woodford co-edited the book. The status is a big source of state behavior and seeking status. So pop star is doing status in a different way. Great powers status is more durable. They want to stay there as powerful and respected. There's a lot of components to it. Status is also in the eye of the beholder. It's like beauty, So in order to get that, you need certain attributes, markers, etc. So for pop star, maybe the markers are maybe different, how they sing or act or look, but that's not the invitation stakes. It could be material or non-material, but not. So I won't go too far. Hindering versus restraining, that is a question of debate. I prefer restraining in IR. Restrain is sort of a restrain not to stop. Restrain can also be restrained behavior. Drink one alcohol, one bottle, not two. So less aggressiveness of it. Hindering could be good too. I don't have an answer to Russia. It's a very fascinating thing you just said about this new alignments happening in the Middle East and also in the Russia-China world. Suddenly, Russia and China are conducting exercise together, but they haven't signed a treaty yet. So which means, to me, it's a limited hard balance, which could become, actually, it's connected to the question about where we are heading. So if you go to a typical realist, John Mearsheimer, who, by the way, has a book from Yale on the same liberal failure, and he will say, just wait. Hard balancing is returning in its intense way. It's like the tiger is coming. But the problem with that logic, even Walls used to say that, globalization and all, no, it's all short periods. History has these periods of balancing and non-balancing. Are we going to leave aside that non-balancing period and say that, okay, only we care about when there was intense balance of power competition? that's like studying history only for the big wars, all the other things you ignore. I think my answer to that is we really don't know the context of emerging international order, depending on the 5 or 6 factors I mentioned. But I don't want to say power doesn't matter, or the powerful doesn't matter. Who gains the next technology, next economic power, will have an ability to shape the world. So even if you don't believe in power and power of the small states, you only need to go to Asia Pacific today, which I often do, and ask people in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore, or even in India, well, China is coming, okay? Now they don't know how it is going to come. Whether it will succeed completely, that's now a big question mark, whether this BRI will succeed. So if it's going to be a bipolar world, will it be the same? Because China is not building exactly what America is building. What America is going to do with its big ships, and then the Russians are building their big missiles. So these 3 types of building, will they converge and become another bipolar, tripolar system? And then there is India, which is always a potential power, never reached there, There are some parameters. So we have complex international order today, but I would agree with you that the future is not going to be the past, because the great powers cannot dictate even to the smallest fry. In South Asia, an interesting thing is happening. The small states, there are bargaining between China and India. We call that a bipolar system there, regionally. These small states are able to get as much money from China, then they go to India, you give us some. And they change sides, or not change sides, but they don't form military coalitions. They're playing very deft games. I don't know how long that will last, obviously, but the point is, in a condition where there is competition for allegiance or preventing alliances, the small states can play some games, and they're doing that. So, small states may have a chance, but institutions, future of institutions, question mark some of them. There's going to be populist onslaught for a period of time, unless they can solve some of the issues that generate populism, including refugees or migration plus the internal inequalities. So, order in the future, and then we have to look into the role of the order maker. We are missing that in the world today. Okay? We don't have powerful, good leaders. European Union used to have, the original creators, or the early post-World War period, that kind of order creation that Eikenberry talks about. What we have are very hodgepodge and kind of populist guys without much historical depth, knowledge of things. So you can get into a lot of conflict as a result of mismanagement of the international order. And those worries persist, but order has a way of returning. Doesn't mean that we want to stay there as what we are, but we need more creative thinking, that's all I would say.
Great. Before I wrap up and thank Professor Paul, I would just take 1 minute to remind you about the next CIPS event, which is next week on Thursday the 27th, when we have Professor Sylvia Bashkevin coming from University of Toronto. She's going to talk, like you, about her latest book, and that one is called Women as Foreign Policy Leaders, Evidence an evaluation of U.S. national security and feminist politics since 1980. So that should be really interesting. That talk is next week, Thursday the 27th at noon. Today, I think we've had a really, really fascinating talk, and one of the things that I really appreciated about it is your willingness to tackle the big questions of international relations, peace and war, and structure, rather than the easy way out for many of us is to pick a small topic and look at it in detail. So it's refreshing to hear a big, expansive vision of order and authority, and also obviously something that is very pertinent to the present moment in international politics. So, TV Paul, it's been a pleasure having you at CIPS. I hope you will come back next time. In a few years, knowing you, I think there won't be too long before there's another new book, so we will glad to have you back then. For now, thank you so much for coming, and the book is available at the back of the room.
I'll be happy to sign mine if anybody wants to buy.
Thank you, that was fascinating. It's really very interesting to hear that the big picture, right?
Most people do small pictures.
It is not, it
Will
is
this
black.
be edited because they're taking it?
I am not sure. I will ask Stephanie. I think they tend to just put it up as it is. Is there anything you would like to
What
take
we are
out?
talking now.
No, that will be taken
That's
out.
what I
Yes,
thought.
yes,
And the last part can be filled.
yes.
For any,
Yeah, and they may take the Q&A out because I'm not sure they can capture the voices
Yeah,
from the
voices.
back of the room. They
How
have
long
a
they-
directional.
how long does it take for that?
I will get Stephanie to let you know when it's up.
Because I like to put it on.
Yeah, so as soon as it's up, I'll get Stephanie to notify you. I think she normally does that anyway. I'll also, so I'm not sure about the Q&A. They may have to take it out
Yeah.
because we can't capture.
I think the Peter's voice was.
I'm not sure. I always wonder why we don't.
Where are you going?
We're going to my office. Unspeakably messy office.
Well, it's Malcolm, a great mind. Somebody once told me, if your brain is organized, you can have a messy office. I use that as an excuse, but mine gets
So I just sign it one.
Professor Prof, how are you? Nice to meet you. I have a question also. So in relation to institutions, how can states rely on them when they lack accountability and sometimes they lack, they're also undemocratic in some way?
Yeah.
And
Not in the civil service.
International legitimacy doesn't need democracy.
I always used to say, you get more security. And I would say, the only thing I do is anything possible, I walk away from the state. So the security guards who come around and check your office, they will protect this. Look, there must be something classified. Never got it. Everybody else who had these clean offices always.
No, that is true. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry,
Okay.
it's on the.
So we'll wait for Stephanie. 20 minutes or so.
And I will just return these books.
Okay.
And pretty good?
Yeah, it's actually pretty good. It's interesting.
Yeah.
There you go. Very well.
Did you get it signed? I'm going to buy one. I'm going to buy one for Michael because I know Steve will like that.
I have to go finish my lecture for 2:30.
Oh, good.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes,
Teaching
absolutely.
today?
I am teaching 3 hours. I know.
Mine is tomorrow.
I know. Well, we have to do it, right? We're supposed to be doing
If it weren't for students, this would be a great job.
it. See you later. Thank you again. Great to see you.
Yeah, democracy is not needed for international order. You know, we are assuming that all countries are international. In concert of Europe time, there was no democracy.
yeah, true. Okay.
So-
So they don't
We
really
as
need accountability.
liberals have a tendency to view democracy necessary for legitimacy.
Yes.
Not really. For great powers,